You're watching this video because I am sure that this thought has crossed your mind, especially with the news headlines as of late. Markets are achieving all-time highs, and jargon around headlines in the news is all about when is this rally going to end? When is the next market crash? Is there a correlation between now and the late 1920s and 30s, the Great Depression? But it's important when you think about this, when you think about if the market does crash, what happens in my portfolio? Do I run the risk of outliving my portfolio? It is important to not let your emotions get the best of you. And that's why a plan is paramount, very important. So with that, let's dive into a couple who has a $650,000 portfolio and they're approaching retirement. We'll go through what happens if the market drops suddenly. What does this do to our overall plan? How about longevity risk? What happens if I live another 5 years, 10 years? What does that do to my plan? So here we have James and Lindy. And today, James and Lindy are 63 years old. They're still working today. James has a salary of $75,000 and Lindy has a salary of $55,000. Going into their savings, currently they aren't saving anything, but they do have retirement accounts. We will get into that in just a minute. Going into their expenses, they spend pre-retirement $5,500 a month. Now going into their net worth, we can see here that they have $650,000 invested. In James's IRA, he has $225,000. Lindy has $150,000 in her IRA. James has a Roth with $75,000, and then they have a joint taxable brokerage account with $200,000. Going into their goals, they would like to retire at the age of 65. If possible, spend $5,000 per month in retirement. And then we're going to add this additional goal, this other goal here. And what that is they would like to, every year up until the age of 80, spend $2,400 a year, whether this be for travel, miscellaneous things, events, just whatever it may be that's not included already in their budget. Going into their retirement analysis, we can see today that with all of these inputs, they have a 100% probability of success with $2.5 million in ending assets. And so let's just dive right into the stress test. Right away, there's a couple things that I want to bring up and a couple things that will be impacted as we look at stress testing, longevity, what happens if we live longer, and market crashes. And that is, we need to think about what are the goals, what are the retirement goals for James and Lindy? Do they want to relocate? Do they want to travel more, buy a new house, spend more time with grandkids? What does their retirement look like? What is it that they are trying to accomplish? We then want to go through their portfolio. How are they allocated? Do they need income from this portfolio? Or do they have enough income from Social Security or other income to cover their monthly expenses? How are they allocated to support this income if there is a need from their portfolio? And where are these assets held? We saw here that they have quite a bit in those pre-tax qualified accounts, but they also have that joint taxable account, and James has that Roth. So how does our asset location play into it? Before we actually dive into that stress test, I want to take a step back and look at how they are allocated across all of their accounts. And we can see here that today they're 66% equity and 34% fixed income. We're assuming a hypothetical annual return of 8.6% and a standard deviation of 10.7%. So now let's toggle back to the retirement and go to the stress test. And using this current plan, that allocation of 66-34, let's see what it looks like if equity markets drop a sudden 30%. How does this impact our plan? And we can see here that this doesn't really do much to our plan. We still have a 99.9% probability of success. Well, what happens if James and Lindy live for another 10 years? Do they run the risk of running out of money? And we can see here that no, they still have that 99.9% probability of success. What happens if Social Security, which they are relying on heavily, drops by 60%? How does this impact their retirement? And we can see here that Looking at Social Security, they now have a 61.7% probability of success if Social Security were to drop by 60%. Why? Because they still have those monthly expenses and they are relying on that Social Security income as income in retirement. Therefore, when they lose that benefit, they are losing a significant portion of the income that they're bringing in retirement. If we go into our retirement analysis here and we go to our withdrawal rate, we can see here that we are relying on our portfolio for, sub 4.5% for the majority of retirement. So that means that Social Security benefit is making up a good chunk of our income. We're only pulling out 4% of this portfolio to live on, as we see here throughout retirement. So a couple things I want to run through here. Sure, we looked at the stress test and things look good, but I want to go in here and create a proposed plan. What happens if we retire at the age of 62? And what happens instead of our current allocation? What happens if we use a growth allocation, both now and in retirement? How is this going to impact our plan? Well, we can see here from a probability of success perspective, it doesn't do much. But if we go into our stress test and we go into our proposed portfolio and we reset the Social Security, and then we assume, okay, what does it look like if equity markets drop immediately by 30%? What does this do to our probability of success? And we can see here that we go from 99.9% down to 95%. Going from our current portfolio to our growth portfolio added more equity exposure into our portfolio. Therefore, if equity markets drop by that 30%, we are going to feel it more. So I want to go back to our retirement analysis, and I want to look at what does it look like, assuming here we retire at 62. What if we retire at 62 and we spend $6,000 per month in retirement? What does this look like relative to us outliving our money? And we can see here that we have an 81% probability of success with $1.2 million in median ending assets. This is assuming that growth portfolio. So what if we bring it back to the current allocation? What happens now? And we can see here we go from that 81% probability of success down to an 80% probability of success with just over $1 million. But for James and Lindy, they're still in a really good spot here. We saw that relative to their goals, they didn't have much when it came to planning, legacy planning. So for them, this might make sense. It might make sense for James and Lindy to think about retiring at the age of 62. To think about spending $6,000 per month in retirement, and then testing this portfolio against different market environments. What happens if those equity markets drop? What happens if Social Security gets cut? What happens if James and Lindy live longer? What happens if taxes get increased? What happens if asset return is lower by 1%, 2%, 3%? Let's go over that really quick. What happens in our proposed plan if equity markets drop immediately by 20% and asset return is reduced by 3%? What does this do to their plan? And we can see that looking at market drop immediately, we have a 57.8% probability of success, and then we have a 39.1% probability of success if assets decrease by 3% per year. So this is what we need to be mindful of. We need to think strategically about our plan and set our plan up in a way that helps us achieve our retirement goals, yes, but also takes into consideration how are we allocated? Where are those assets located? And if adverse market environments come our way, what does our portfolio look like? How do we fare in those environments? Guys, it's very important to create a plan like this so that you have an idea of how your investments are working for you and what you can look at relative to if any of these things were to happen in your retirement or even pre-retirement. As always, guys, thank you so much. If you want to create a plan just like this and go through a stress test just like this, I invite you to click the Create Your DIY Retirement Plan in the description, and we'll see you there. And until next time, thank you so much. Bye-bye.